As previously mentioned, the U.S. troops actually drove out the Filipino Liberation Army from Manila, and therefore U.S. troops take over the capital city of Manila. And the Philippine government had to set up its headquarters at a different location, obviously, and they flee north of Manila to a place called Malolos, and therefore, of course, the name Malolos Constitution. And we also acknowledge that their leader was Emilio Aguinaldo. And again, he's being sought after by the U.S. troops, right? And he's seen as a key to the end of the war. Once they capture Aguinaldo, well, they could pretty much end what they called, the U.S. troops that is, what they called an insurrection, quote unquote. Okay, so this is the first phase of the war, actually lasts just a few months because it was very lopsided in the favor of the American troops, right? You had thousands of Filipino soldiers killed, and that's despite tenacious resistance and even, as I mentioned, the fanatical fighting spirit of the Filipinos. Many of them, in fact, charged with only their native machetes because there was not enough rifles to distribute. So that's pretty fanatical, knowing you're going to be shot, right? And when it came to the Americans, in terms of casualties, they only lost less than 100 men and probably several thousand wounded during this first phase of the war, known as the conventional stage. So why were the Filipinos being routed? As I described, it's really because of the inferior arms that the Filipino Revolutionary Army possessed. As I also mentioned just now, they only were armed with machetes. They called them bolos, sometimes spears, right? Also, I have to mention there was lack of cohesion in the leadership. There was a lot of divisions, different factions within the leadership group of the feudal elite. Okay, so there was no united front among the Filipinos, it seemed. Okay, you had tension between landowners and business owners and, the actual political leaders. Okay, so this first phase has been described as a new Indian War, so to speak. What does this mean? It means that in many ways, this part of the war was an extension of the Indian War. What is the Indian War? The Indian War was fought right with the end of the Civil War. Now, the Civil War lasted until 1865. And as we described, the United States is moving west. Consider the Civil War as a brief interim in that movement. But with the conclusion of the Civil War, of course, this westward movement resumes in earnest. But what's the obstacle there? Well, the obstacle are Native American civilizations, namely the Sioux, the Sioux tribe, and their various allies. And the U.S. troops moving west are fighting the Sioux during this Indian War that lasts over a decade in this period. Okay, so what I'm saying here is that once the Indian War ended by 1890, many of those veterans that fought in the Indian War would be shipped over across the Pacific to fight a new type of quote-unquote Indian. Okay, that's the Filipinos, of course. And indeed, many of the veterans saw them in the same light as they saw the Indians, that is to say, as savages, barbarians, and so forth. Okay, that they're fighting this new Indian in a new frontier. But, of course, the frontier is closed by 1890. The new frontier would be the Pacific region now. All right, so as I mentioned, westward movement didn't stop once we reached the shores of the Pacific in 1890. No, it proceeds unremittingly west. And at this point of our discussion, we find the United States in the Philippines, right, by 1899 and 1900, fighting this war, this new Indian War, so to speak. Okay, so here is a quote taken from a journalist, again from the National Geographic, regarding this war. The United States was a, quote, fit representative of humanity, invincible in war, yet generous to fallen foes, subjugators of lower nature, and conquerors of the powers of primal darkness. Now, this quote in itself should remind you of Senator Beveridge. The fact that the United States are representative of all of humankind, right, to conquer the powers of primal darkness, or the savage and senile peoples, to use Beveridge's words. And why are we doing that? These people of lower nature, so to speak, the savages, we're bringing with us civilization, right? Of course, we call this the civilizing mission. So here's the National Geographic reminding us of this recurrent motif here, a recurrent theme of civilizing mission. And again, that's used to justify this war. And so again, we enter this phase in the war, the guerrilla phase. And of course, the Americans are clearly superior, as mentioned. The Philippine Army of Liberation could not win any significant victories on the battlefields fighting conventional warfare. So the leader, Aguinaldo, decides by November 1899 to shift tactics, to change tactics from conventional warfare to guerrilla combat. This is seen as their final option in order to survive. Therefore, that Army of Liberation, the actual formal army, right, official army, was dissolved into different factions, and now they're ordered to fight a guerrilla warfare. And by the way, what is guerrilla warfare, if you're not familiar with that? It's basically small-scale military engagement. What you do, instead of, employing military strategy, you use tactics like surprise ambushes, use sabotage, all of this stuff instead of battlefield tactics. And this is a very effective way of fighting if you're clearly outnumbered and, if you can't match them in terms of military might. Okay, this has happened in much of military history, and especially in the 19th and 20th century in this colonial context. Okay, so certainly it happens in the Philippines. Let's remind you that this is the New Indian War, right? The Filipinos are seen as the, quote, New Indians. And the attempt is to first exterminate, then to civilize, not unlike the Native Americans on the continent before 1890. And obviously the Filipinos are trying to stave off the possibility of extermination, right? And that's why we entered this war. Now, here is where the United States sees a new approach that they will deem to be, quote-unquote, uncivilized, okay? In the eyes of the American leaders, military leaders, and certainly the troops, civilized combat is fought on the battlefield, right? And it's not guerrilla warfare. And therefore, this enrages American officers and military strategists. This leads the United States to adopt tactics including torture, a take no prisoners approach, even the killing of civilians, and rounding them up into concentration camps that they called reconcentrado camps, as mentioned there on the slide. By the way, that's obviously taken from the Spanish approach, right? Reconcentrado camps. Okay, so this is the new phase. By the way, the U.S. expected speedy victory once Aguinaldo fled, but, what happened is a protracted, prolonged insurgency throughout all the islands. Okay. And to be more specific, geographically speaking, here's Manila on the island of Luzon, the northern island. The U.S. troops tried to move southward and conquer the Visayas and even eventually Mindanao. But Mindanao was basically impervious to military incursions in that area for the most part. But certainly in this area, the U.S. tried to extend its military conquest. But let's also remember that the Filipinos are using guerrilla warfare. And because they're using warfare, it's justifying all these other tactics. Now, let's remember torture. By the way, what is it in the Constitution that basically states America does not partake in torture? Okay, you may be familiar with the phrase stated in the Constitution in one of the amendments. Well, that phrase is cruel and unusual punishment, quote unquote. Okay, and in the context, when that was written in the Constitution, it was referring to torture that was commonly practiced by, let's say, monarchs, kings, what have you, against, or emperors, against their political foes. They would imprison them in the dungeon, right? No due process, so to speak, no habeas corpus, just toss them in the dungeon and let them rot, and in the process, also employed torture techniques. So the United States is enlightened, right? We believed when we actually wrote the Constitution. We don't partake in that. But here we are, more than 100 years later, actually adopting tactics of torture. Well-known torture, by the way, is this right here. And this is called the water cure, as mentioned in this picture. And what they do is take that person that's captured, they subdue the captive, and they hold him down, and they pour water down his throat. That's what's happening here, in order to interrogate that person. Okay? And notice it says here, a harmless method of torture alleged to have been occasionally practiced, right? Alleged, when in fact there's a picture being taken here. In fact, it was widely practiced, okay? Torture, and especially this, the water cure. Now, many of you have heard of this, right? This is now known as waterboarding. And it was practiced by, American intelligence and so forth against various captives after 9/11, especially in Guantanamo Bay. It was called, by the way, by the intelligence apparatus as, quote, enhanced interrogation, unquote. Okay, enhanced interrogation. So where was waterboarding invented? The Philippine-American War. Okay. It also deserves mention that Filipinos also tortured American captives of war. Okay, one way that they tortured, and by the way, I should put up a, trigger alert here. We're talking about torture here. But one method that they did is bury that American soldier up to his head, right? And cover him with like honey or something, and let the jungle ants devour that American troops. Okay. So this was one way of torture that was conducted by Filipinos. Torture happened both ways. Okay, but these are some scenes of war here, right? Civilians being captured, take no prisoners, massive casualties. There's some American troops here, right? Many of them veterans of the Indian War. And then here's the Filipino Revolutionary Army, or the Liberation Army. Here's some battle scenes here.